Didn't.
I just don't think the current Prime Minister knows what he's talking about. When Labor was in, the naval shipyards were full. There were a lot of building going on. But, Mr Morrison, we're not talking about the Navy. These guys just don't know what they're talking about. They don't know for Arthur or Martha half the time. I mean, we need a merchant marine. We have a Prime Minister who doesn't understand Australian shipping. The Navy doesn't carry oil. The Navy doesn't carry iron ore, coal and steel. The Navy doesn't carry containers to Australia. The Navy doesn't carry passengers between Melbourne and Tasmania. We need our own ships in Australia, which are registered in Australia. We're going to keep fighting for this because we are an island nation. What often happens, I think, all too often in Australian politics is if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. Australian ships sail far beyond the edge of the Australian continent. We don't see them. I come from a family of seafarers. We are a seafaring nation. If you don't have a merchant marine, there will not be enough skilled seafarers in times of war to supplement the Navy. If you don't have an Australian merchant marine in times of conflict, and we live in very unstable times, we will pay a lot more to move cargoes to Australia and to move cargoes from Australia. For goodness sakes, Liberal National Government in Canberra, we're an island nation. Switzerland has more ships registered in Switzerland than we do in Australia. I'll give you a tip. Switzerland's landlocked. So we've got a government who can't think beyond the end of their nose. They know nothing about trade and shipping. So if Mr Morrison wants to say that a discussion about more Australian merchant marine ships is about more warships, well then he's even less bright than I think.
Is the government actually doing enough in regards to finding out why Australian coal exports are actually facing processing issues in China?
I think this is a serious development. Unlike some, I don't want to immediately leap and blame the Chinese government. I think we need to understand what's going on here. We're getting mixed messages, aren't we? We're hearing some people say that this is some deliberate policy because of the views of the Australian government to China. I'm actually not going to leap to that judgment. But it just reminds us again, doesn't it? We're an island nation. We depend on our mining industry. That's why I support our mining industry. But what it also shows is that we can't take our future for granted. It can't just be about quarterly profits and short-term profit motivations. We need a government in Canberra who thinks long-term. Unlike the current government, I'm proposing that Australia has more merchant ships. That helps keep down the costs. It protects the environment of the Australian coastline. It means we'll have more skilled seafarers in the future. And in times of conflict, we can move our army and our troops where we need to, when we need to, and we can keep making sure that vital supplies come to Australia. The one thing that the Chinese coal issue certainly reminds me of, and is a wake-up call for all of Australia, we can't take our sea trade for granted. We can't take our fuel security for granted. We need to put steps in place now, because I promise you this, I can't predict what the future will be, but history, if it's any indicator, shows that if we neglect our merchant marine and having Australian ships, at some point in the future the nation will wake up and say, why don't we have more ships? I'm not prepared to wait for that. If Labor gets elected, we're going to stand up for Australian economic and national independence.
With all due respect, you haven't actually answered the question. The question is whether or not Australian coal exports are actually, like, why are they facing processing delays in China? And is the government doing enough for that?
With all due respect, we don't know the answer. But what I'm saying out of this is that it shows, and I don't want to leap to conclusions, there's a lot of China bashing goes on in parts of our political debate. I'm going to be a Prime Minister, if elected, who's sensible. Now, if there is a government policy, we need to get to the bottom of it and stop it and change it. But I don't want to start jeopardising our trade by making hysterical headline hunting gestures. We don't know. I know that the government is working on it. And whilst I think this is a government who's got the wrong priorities in terms of healthcare and education and their wages and cost of living, on an issue as important, as sensitive as this, the last thing that the Australian people need, or our coal industry needs, is the two political parties trying to play the blame game.
On the new shipping fleet, you have said it's on national security grounds, so do you have any evidence there is a risk to our current fleet, and if so, why?
In the last 30 years, we've seen the national shipping fleet decline from 100 vessels to 14. That's a risk. 86 ships off the Australian coastline and beyond. Even now in the ports of Australia, we have foreign registered vessels doing everything from barges to all sorts of work, which can be done by Australian seafarers, paid Australian conditions in Australian registered ships. Now, I make no apology for standing up to the economic rationalists of the right wing of Australian political life and saying, you mightn't think there's a value to having Australian seafarers and Australian ships carrying Australian cargo. I disagree. I'm a student of history, and I just say to the Australian people, we're an island nation. We're the only nation in the world who's in charge of a whole continent. The idea that we don't have ships registered in Australia, paying Australian conditions, run under Australian standards, carrying Australian cargoes to and from Australia is wrong. So we think there is a massive crisis. We think that we have a fuel security problem in Australia. Since about 2012, Australia's become a net importer of fuel. Before then, we were a net exporter. The international standards for fuel reserves in Australia show that we don't meet the international standards. So in other words, if all of a sudden the shipping routes to Australia were cut off, or all of a sudden if some country who didn't like Australia's policies turned off the oil taps, we'd be in trouble. That's why we need Australian ships.
Can the ships be built here or recommissioned?
Well, the reality is some of the ships that were built overseas, I'd like to see us start again with a shipbuilding industry and a ship repair industry in Australia, but I'll just settle for having Australian ships with Australian crews carrying Australian cargoes.
Are you confident, a completely different issue, are you confident that asylum seekers will actually get adequate treatment on Christmas Island, given the fact that locals are saying there aren't adequate health facilities there?
Listen, we know the government's run out of anything to talk about in Australia except scaring people about boats. Let me be very clear about Labor's position. We support regional processing. What that means is that we're saying to the vile trade of people smugglers, if you say to people that they can get on boats and come to Australia, under a Labor government, we will resettle these people overseas. That's our policy. And we will support having strong borders and properly resourcing our border force, the men and women of that, and of course our Australian Defence Forces. That's our policy. In terms of the government wanting to talk about medical treatment in Christmas Island, I'm not falling for that bait. The reality is that Christmas Island doesn't have very much in the way of medical care. If the government want to just have some political debate and move a whole lot of resources and build hospitals there, well, I think that just shows you they're not fair income. So, listen, we know what this government's about, and I think most Australians do. This is a government under which the cost of living, everything's going up except your wages. This is a government which for the last 6 years has seen $3 billion of the Medicare bill put back on the shoulders of Australians and the wallets and the purses of Australians. This is a government where we've seen cuts to public schools. We've seen cuts to universities and TAFE. This is a government who doesn't want to talk about their record. They just want to run a despicable and shameful fear campaign. Well, I and the Australian people are better than what the government think. And the other thing they don't want to talk about, of course, is the stench of the rottenness of the administration of this government. In the last 2 weeks alone, and no wonder they don't want to have any more parliament before the election, because we keep finding out the secrets the government want to cover up. In the last 2 weeks alone, we've learned that they handed out a $423 million taxpayer contract to a company called Paladin to look after these detention centres, and this company was registered in a beach shack down a dirt track in Kangaroo Island. That's rotten. We find out that there's an old boys club of mates sorting out each other's holidays through the treasurer of the Liberal Party and a company called Hello World, who also, somewhat fortuitously, gets a lot of government contracts. We've seen Mr Stuart Robert fess up to a $40,000 internet bill, and he's never satisfactorily explained what on earth you download that costs you $40,000. We've got the chairman of one of their parliamentary committees, Mr Tim Wilson, teeing up the sitting of parliamentary committees to coincide with investor roadshows of important and powerful donors pushing a Liberal Party line. Even as late as last night, we hear scandals about the Liberal candidate in Mayo, Ms Downer, running against Rebecca Sharkey, the fierce independent, and the government's passing off government money as her personal announcements. There are problems in the administration of this government that they don't want to talk about, and that's why they talk about the issues that you raised. These matters go to the heart of corruption in this country. We need a national anti-corruption commission. And that's what I promise the Australian people. We're going to restore your faith, because I understand that the standard of government maladministration you walk past is the standard that you accept.
Just on the Morrison government's Hobart deal announced, do you welcome it and will you match it?
It looks very positive. A lot of the things which they've said, we've already said. It's a good announcement and we're happy to look at it seriously, but this is what government should be doing, investing in infrastructure. What I wish the government would announce is a wages policy. What I wish this government would announce is an energy policy which will lower prices. What I wish this government would announce is just reversing all the cuts to Medicare and the cuts to schools and the cuts to hospitals. I wish this government would announce doing more for our pensioners than they're currently doing. When they do something right, I'll give them a tick. But really, after 6 years, what has this government got to show you? There's cuts to schools and hospitals, there's cuts to aged care. Their treatment of aged care is so bad they had to call a royal commission to practically investigate themselves now. We've got the maladministration and crony government, jobs for the donors and support for the donors. This is a government who essentially has done nothing for 6 years, and now all they want to do is frighten people. That's not really enough of a reason to be re-elected at the next election. Thanks, everybody.
We've been hearing there from the opposition leader Bill Shorten in Melbourne, responding to questions from the media off the back of an announcement that should Labor win the next election, they will put efforts towards establishing a merchant marine shipping fleet in Australia. And Victoria, let's go there live now.
I'm a member of Gippsland South and Melina Bath, our upper house state MP as well. It's great to be here. It's obviously a very sombre topic for us here in Gippsland. The drought is starting to bite very deeply for a lot of our dryland agriculture, and the farmers we met with today have been making it very clear to us all that they are going through some pretty tough times. For some of our farming communities, this is the worst drought they've experienced in 100 years. So we need to keep working with them. I've got to say I'm very pleased with the way Minister Littleproud and the Prime Minister have been responsive to the concerns I've raised about making sure we try and reduce the amount of red tape around farm household allowance, making sure we work with our local government members to try and get more infrastructure into our regional communities, and also working with the farming families themselves about how we can help their properties be more sustainable in the longer term. We all know it's going to rain again. It'll rain again. We want to make sure that our farmers are going to be viable in the longer term. So today's about listening to our farming families, getting a better appreciation of the on-the-ground impacts of the drought and what other steps we might need to take in partnership with both state and local government to try and reduce some of those cost structures and make sure our farming families are here for a very long time to come. So with those words, PM, it's great to have you here in Gippsland. I would have preferred you had brought nice grey skies and a couple of inches of rain, but if it can't rain, it might as well be beautiful like today. Thanks, PM.
Thanks, Darren. And that is the purpose of my being here today. It doesn't matter what corner of the country you are in. If you're being affected by drought, I'm interested. Whether it's here in Gippsland, whether it's in Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, doesn't matter where it is. Our government is keenly interested in the plight of our rural communities. Of course, those on farm, but also those who are in the towns who depend on the agricultural sector to provide the livelihood that exists right across Australia in rural and regional centres. So it's been a good opportunity to come here today and have a listen. It doesn't matter where I might be, the stories are different, the challenges are often different, the country is different, and that means always you've got to have a very local response, and that's why a big part of our response is to work with the local shires and councils. Support that we provide through those councils, that immediate support we put in through our drought recovery program, that is, we know, providing some useful support. But it's not everything, whether it's the farm household allowance or the other measures that we put in place. This is all important. But every single part of the country does need its own response. It does need its own plan, and that's why I've been pleased to come here today and meet with so many, and I'll be meeting with more later on this afternoon. I'm meeting with Premier Andrews tomorrow. We'll be talking about a large number of topics, but this will be one, and there's been some feedback here for me today, but there's also been some important feedback here today for the state, and I'm sure he'll be interested in hear my first-hand relaying of that to the state government. I know the Victorian Agricultural Minister has been out here and he would have got it first-hand too, I imagine, and got some fairly direct feedback. So we'll have those discussions when we meet together tomorrow. There have been some announcements today, but I'm not overstating what they are. Some of them relate to parts of this district, but others don't. And what's most important is that we ensure that how we're responding to the drought is as useful here as it is in other parts of the country, and that's principally why I've come along today. I'm going to ask David to talk a bit about some of those particular announcements, but I do stress that they don't particularly directly impact, particularly where we're standing today, but in other parts of the district they do.
Well, thanks, PM. But can I firstly say, last week we saw the lowest political act in this nation's history when the Labor Party and Karen Phelps voted against the Future Drought Fund to politicise the misery of these people is something I'd never thought I'd see in this nation. They become irrelevant to this debate, and every Australian should be ashamed that they would vote against a future fund that goes to protect regional rural Australia, make sure that we're prepared for future droughts. For them to vote against that is the lowest political act I've ever seen. But we're going to get on with the job, as the PM has said, and we're going to be agile, continue to be agile. We're going to come and listen. You don't want Canberra solutions, you want local solutions. So today, we're proud to announce $31 million for the McAllister Water Project, here to get greater efficiency, a project that was started 80-odd years ago, and to be able to make sure we get greater efficiency, to make sure there's more water available during the dry times. And so we're proud to be able to partner. We would ask the state government to consider kicking the tin with us. But we're also not just looking at irrigation. We're looking for those farmers that are out there doing it tough, that don't have access to irrigation. We're also announcing on-farm water measure efficiency programs up to $25,000 or 25%. The federal government will kick in, and that'll allow farmers to desilt dams, to get in there while things are dry now and desilt those dams, or to put in pipes, troughs, to get greater water efficiency. And it'll also reach out to the state government and ask them to kick the tin as well. In other states, they're doing it. This would be a real tactile program that'll give real results to farmers on the ground while they have the opportunity to do it now. But while cash flow is tight, it'll be an opportunity to help them make these strategic investments in the here and now.
Well, look, happy to take some questions, and we've got others who can field some of those questions as well. Let's just talk about what we're here today about. I've already done a press conference earlier today on more broader matters. I can take one or two on that if you insist, which I'm sure you will. So why don't we deal with the issues we're here to talk about today, and Darren and David and others come and join me, because you can respond to those as well.
What was some of the feedback you received yourself?
Well, I think one of the two key things that seem to be really impacting at the moment is obviously the impacts on cash flow, and the fodder transport and the fodder subsidies that are being provided by state governments elsewhere aren't being provided here in Victoria, and that's a real issue of concern. Rate relief as well is another big issue, and again that's an issue that is a state government matter. And look, so I'll pass those on to Dan tomorrow. I'm sure he's quite aware of those. He would have got the same big feedback when his Ag Minister was out here over the course of the week. We'll do the things that we can do, and David has, I think, just set out what they are. I mean, two of the biggest areas of success in providing relief that we've found in our response to the drought, and this was also backed up at our drought summit last year, and then the follow-on from that has been the support we've put in the councils and the support we've put in the on-farm infrastructure. These two things have, as we've got the feedback from farming communities all across the country, they have been working well. Now, they are being rolled out here as well now, and but the other issue is, how long will this go on for? And I think there is a natural and understandable anxiety about what you're planning for. How long is a piece of string? In parts of the country, they've been in drought for 7 years. We're not down that far down the road here compared to those parts of the country. So I think there's a natural anxiety about how much you can do and what you're trying to prepare for. Farm household allowance, we didn't get a lot of feedback on that today, but we've got the Rural Financial Counsellors there to support people if you need that. I think David can update on how many people, we've got
380.
About 380 in this part of the world who are getting support on that. And if others need it, then the Rural Financial Counsellors can come and assist you with that, and Darren's office can support you in making sure you get access to that. The other thing we've put in is support for the mental health services locally. Again, that has to be driven locally, but I would only ask all of those in the district to keep an eye out for each other. That's very important. Doesn't matter what part of the country you're in. People tend not to volunteer how they're feeling about this stuff. That's, people are tough, and they certainly like to be seen that way. But know that people are there to support you and care for you, and these services can just help you deal with a really tough time. So we're putting additional support into that, but it's not the whole solution. It's just part of the support network that's needed.
The Victorian Farmers Federation, the Wellington Shire Council and the East Gippsland Shire Council have all raised concerns that the criteria with the federal drought funding is too restrictive and it's not going to things that are actually helping farmers on the ground. What have you got to say to those concerns?
Well, one of the biggest things that It's Wellington, isn't it?
Wellington
has done has been doing water cartage, which has had a great response. And that was one of the pieces of feedback that we've had. Remember that the $1 million we give to the council is not there as the entire response to the issues facing farmers on the land. That's where the on-farm infrastructure incentives, that's what they're there for. That's what the farm household allowance is for. It is not the only thing. The principal role of those funds that go into those councils is to ensure that there is money and circulating in the local economy. It's as much to keep local jobs, whether they are people who previously may have been working on a farm and now can't because the farm isn't doing the work that it was doing before, and now they can be working in other areas, we've got people in Queensland doing it to build dog fences, we've got others upgrading amenity blocks, we've got some who are doing roads, others are doing water cartage. So around the country, the response has been that the parameters have been quite good. And the important thing is it's giving local communities the decision-making about how they spend the money.
The feedback we've had from many farmers and councils is anger and frustration. We've got the Wellington Shire Council spending $500,000 on upgrading their sale yards, and the East Gippsland Shire Council is spending $700,000 on resurfacing car parks. Farmers are wondering, how does that actually help them on the ground battling the drought?
Well, I'll let Darren respond to that, but again, the $1 million to the councils is not intended as a farm subsidy. That's not its purpose. It was never designed that way. It was about understanding that all the towns through drought-affected communities, because those towns will not be getting the income from those from the ag sector coming in and spending in the towns, that won't be there. There will be a cash drought in the towns because of the drought that is occurring on the properties. And so that's its purpose. And so there are many things we have to do. And that's just one of the things. But Darren might want to comment. And the decisions are made locally, not by the Commonwealth.
Thanks, PM. And to clarify, as the Prime Minister is saying, the infrastructure grants that local government's been provided with is intended to improve local infrastructure, to boost the local economy. And I want to defend both East Gippsland Shire and Wellington Shire in that regard. The money they're spending is going to improve agricultural facilities for the longer term. This is money that would need to be spent anyway. If the council had to find it from their own rate revenue, it would be money taken from local roads, it would be money taken from local facilities. So the council, I think, has made responsible decisions to invest in their agricultural industries for the longer term. You know, we have a rich and a proud heritage in agricultural industries in Gippsland, but we also have a great future. And part of that great future is having world-class livestock facilities for the sale of stock, making sure that we meet the animal welfare standards and meet the expectations of the buying and the selling public. So I congratulate both councils for investing in the longer term, notwithstanding the fact that there's still more work we can do with local and state governments to address some of those social, economic and environmental issues on farm, and that's why we've been here today listening to farmers' concerns.
So what we've also done is we've rolled this program out. Senator McKenzie has been, I think, very agile in listening to the feedback on the program. I mean, we've made a number of changes along the way, as I have in terms of disaster payments in places that have been stricken by floods. I mean, one of the first things that we did in response to the Townsville floods was to pretty much straight away remove some of the paperwork requirements for people accessing those monies, and that enabled us to get about 40 million out the door in about a week. So the government, I think, has demonstrated an active ear when it comes to how these programs are rolling out on the ground. And frankly, that's the reason I'm here today, is to listen to some of those concerns that have come back. And if the program needs to be altered, then we'll make those calls.
Another question for Mr. Littleproud, if you like.
Sure.
So some of the feedback we've been having from local contractors, so for example, hay cartage contractors, say that we're talking about the red tape around the rural financial household allowance. They say despite, relying on the land for their income, they don't qualify as a farmer per se for the legislation, and therefore are missing out on some assistance that could really help them. Is this something that you will take away from these meetings and maybe reconsider redrafting the legislation?
Well, look, obviously we are here listening, and in fact I've ordered a review of the Farm Household Assistance Program that was started in 2014, so it was long overdue. The reality is, I've got to be honest, that is a safety net. It's a safety net for social security for people. It is not an entitlement. I have to be honest with people. But we are working through with the FHA review team to see whether we can streamline it in terms of not only the application, but in terms of how some of the income is treated, so that it does encompass an understanding of the agricultural sector better. But let me say we'll continue to work through that, and we're putting more rural financial counsellors on the ground. There was 116 RFCS staff. I've put another 39, and we're continuing to go and listen. If there is a need for more rural financial counsellors on the ground, we'll put them there. We've been agile. The PM cut a cheque straight away when we need an additional 39, and we'll continue to do more. But we're not going to make it a Canberra-based solution. It has to be a local solution. If we're asked for that, then we'll look for that.
About on Aussie Farms, you wanted to revoke the charity status of Aussie Farms. What process is that at now? That's
totally incorrect. I have not asked for any charity to have their charitable status revoked in terms of drought. I have written. Oh, sorry, Aussie.
I'm talking about Aussie.
Sorry, Aussie Farmers. Aussie Farmers is a drought charity that was referred to a charity.
I'm talking about Aussie Farms.
Aussie Farms. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
That published the locations of numerous farms.
So obviously that's sent through to the Charities Commission. Under the provision of the Charities Commission, that is something that isn't made public, and I understand they're working through that process as they speak. It's not something that they would refer back to the Agriculture Minister. I understand they're working through that process, but I would hope that they would look very carefully at that, because what this group has done is effectively put an attack map on farmers and their homes where children live. It is abhorrent. I don't think any Australian would say that is what a charity would do. So I'll leave it to the Charities Commission. It's either a reputable organisation in terms of trying to sort this out, but I'd expect some action. I know everyone else would.
Sure, let's do a couple, and then we've got to get on the road.
Are you disappointed that a female wasn't pre-selected for serving?
Well, it was a good field, and the grassroots of the party made a decision after Michael's departure. I was in Tasmania this morning, and down in Tasmania, whether it's in Bass or in Lyons or in our Senate ticket, and in just most recently replacing Senator Bushby. I mean, I think there's been about 17 or 18 now female candidates that have been selected both for the National Party and the Liberal Party since I became Prime Minister, whether it's seats like Lindsay or Macquarie in New South Wales and up, as I've already mentioned, the ones in Tasmania. So, look, these are issues that we'll continue to work on as a party, but at the end of the day, our party rank and file make the decisions, and that's what's happened on this occasion. And our candidate there, who was selected yesterday, I mean, he's an ex-serviceman. He served overseas in peacekeeping missions. He served his country. He used to work on Julie Bishop's staff, in fact. So, look, we had some excellent choices to choose from yesterday, and the party rank and file have done that in Western Australia.
The Liberal Party still has to fill seats vacated by senior MPs, including senior women. How big is that task?
Oh, it's the same task as I was filling any of these seats. I mean, today there's the selection in Higgins, and there'll be a selection in Curtin as well. And the party will go through its normal processes to make their selections in each case. I tell you one thing that won't happen, though. They won't be picked by unions. There won't be big union vote blocks there just coming in and telling our party who our candidate should be. That's how things roll in the Labor Party. That's not how it works in the Liberal Party.
Potentially 12 to 13 weeks from here until the election, long run ahead, how do you feel?
Well, we're just focusing on the things that matter to Australians. That's why I'm here today. We are focused on ensuring our economy is strong so we can support essential services that Australians rely on. As I said earlier today, we have said that from the 1st of next month, 1st of April I should say, there will be access to heart checks for all Australians under the Medicare system. And it's unlimited, I should stress. The Labor Party's put a cap on how much can be done.
We'll have to leave it there due to technical issues. We have been hearing from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and also from Darren Chester, Nationals frontbencher member for Gippsland, and David Littleproud, Minister assisting the Prime Minister for drought preparation and response there in Gippsland, Victoria. We believe that line has been cleared now. We'll return to the Prime Minister.
You can't turn up and provide support, whether it's in the flood-riven communities of North Queensland or drought-savaged communities of Victoria, if you don't have a strong economy. I mean, you're dipping into an empty bucket. And that's what the Labor Party will offer, an empty bucket. The only time there'll be anything in that bucket is if they put their hand in your pocket and take more taxes from you. So running a strong economy enables us to support these important programs, whether it's in the drought-affected communities, flood-affected communities, essential services like on Medicare. I mean, we have the highest level of bulk billing for Medicare on record. That's what we've been able to achieve by running a strong economy and supporting essential services. So you ask me how I feel we're doing a great job focusing on the things that really matter to Australians: their economy, their security, their safety, their future, and standing by them when they're going through stuff which is really tough, like they are here and like they are in many parts of the country. And I think they know, all those quiet Australians out there, they don't get around being advocates, they don't get around, shouting and going to marches and all this sort of thing. They're just trying to keep their farms going, keep their small businesses going. They're taking their kids to school and raising them. They're doing the best they can, running their lives and having their aspirations. And they know I can hear them, and I know exactly what they're saying, and I'm totally on their side. Thanks very much, Ta.
We've been hearing there from the Prime Minister Scott Morrison in Gippsland, Victoria, where he's been joined by Darren Chester, Nationals frontbencher member for Gippsland, and David Littleproud. They're addressing the government's response to drought-affected farming communities. Now let's get the latest in the weather.